welcome everyone. Karthik Ramakrishnan here. I'm a professor of public policy at UCR. I also direct our Center for Social Innovation. We are so thrilled to co-sponsor this event with Zócalo Public Square. The issue of community media, especially coming out of the census, is a very important one for our center. We look forward to the decade of work ahead to make sure that we support media that serves communities of color, to make sure that we all have an equal voice in the future of our democracy. Thank you. We hope you enjoyed the program, and over to you, Moira.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Moira Shuri, and I'm the Executive Director of Zócalo Public Square, a creative unit of Arizona State University. We are proud to partner with the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside for this event. At Zócalo, our mission is to connect people to ideas and to one another. Everything we do is free, and everyone is welcome. We publish original writing and convene events like the one we're watching today. Find out more on our website, zocalopublicsquare.org. We're living through a time when disinformation is more pervasive than an invisible virus. The ways to combat this are complex, and today we're presenting a panel that offers us a path to building and recognizing messengers of truth. And this discussion is in the able hands of our moderator, Joanne Griffith, managing editor of the California Newsroom, a groundbreaking collaboration of NPR and local public radio stations around the state, including Zócalo's great partner, KCRW. It serves California with a special emphasis on boosting news coming from underserved communities and overlooked parts of the state. Joanne previously worked at the radio show Marketplace and has produced shows for the BBC. Over to you, Joanne.
Thank you, Moira. I'm really delighted to speak today with three thoughtful, impressive journalism leaders who also can kind of talk to us about regulation as well, or really to consider how we can positively support community journalism in addition to stopping the spread of disinformation in local news. I am going to say one very small thing, because we are living in the time of COVID where we are all at home with Zooms. If you hear random sounds in the background, then you will understand that I have a very small human here in my house who is doing his very, very level best to be a little bit quiet. So just wanted to flag that in case you're like, what is going on at her house? But hopefully at quieter homes than I do have three guests with me here today. We have Paulette Brown-Hinds. She is the founder of Voice Media Ventures. And I'm going to look down while I'm reading this because these are three very impressive bios that we have here. She is the second generation publisher of The Voice and Black Voice News. She's also the co-founder of the new initiative, Media in Color. She has over 30 years experience in media, not revealing her age at all, but she has a lot of experience in media and has served as the lead Black media strategist for a number of statewide political campaigns, including the campaigns of both Governor Schwarzenegger and Newsom. She's on the board of the California News Publishers Association and was board president in 2019. Paulette, so great to have you here today. Yeah. We also have Ann Ravel. She's an attorney and professor of UC Berkeley Law. She was nominated to the Federal Election Commission by President Obama back in 2013 and served as a commissioner from 2013 to 2017. She served as chair of the FEC in 2015. She was also chair of the California Fair Political Practices Commission. Her current work focuses on digital platforms and public policy and strategies to address digital disinformation, which obviously is going to be very helpful to us today. Hi to you, Anne. And then last but not least, we have Sarabeth Berman. She is the CEO of the American Journalism Project, which uses venture philanthropy to support local newsrooms. She's formerly global head of public affairs at Teach for All. She's also an advocate for the performing arts and serves on the board of directors of the Mark Morris Dark Group. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to start with, we're all journalists, we're all kind of program makers, we've all kind of worked kind of in this area, but it's really important to kind of scene set and really kind of help people with our definitions. So I'm going to start with you, Sarabeth. When we talk about local news, what does local news actually mean to you?
Yeah, it's a good question and worth defining, because I think local news can mean different things to different people. From our perspective, when we talk about local news, we're talking about original reporting. We're talking about the act of reporters going to city hall, to school board meetings, digging into business interest, holding powerful account and really giving communities the information they need to be able to take informed action, to show up at the ballot box with the information that they need, to engage in their communities with the information that they need. So, I mean, if I had to put it succinctly, I'd say this is about original reporting, about institutions, people, and power for local communities. And I distinguish that last part because there are national news organizations that will send in reporters to a local community and they'll report on a place in across our country. But the purpose of the reporting is for a national audience, and it's not grounded in the context of understanding the community, of knowing the various dynamics that are happening in a community. And so that I think really distinguishes local news.
Paulette, what is local news, the definition mean to you?
It's a good question. I often use local news and community media interchangeably. I think for me, it's important public information source that informs and educates, that community. It could be a traditional news organization, or it could be other sources of information that communities rely on. That uphold journalistic principles of like truthfulness, accuracy, transparency. Within that sector, though, I do see diversity. So you could have, corporate-owned media outlets will often have a very different relationship with their community than, say, a community weekly or an ethnic news organization or organizations supporting communities of color. But primarily for me, it is a local news organization really primarily focuses on serving that local community. It's kind of that local news and information source.
And Anne, what's your definition?
Well, I would have combined both Sarabeth and Paulette's, but I actually always think that local news is kind of interactive with the community. And so they understand not just going to City Hall, but they understand what the interests and needs are of the community for civic engagement or for just understanding policies. And also in a big way, and this is something I care a lot about, is investigative journalism, to find out, to get to the root of looking at problems by the government mainly, but sometimes by businesses in the community. So it's kind of like a community dialogue, and I see it with both community and ethnic newspapers. Nobody's talked about TV and radio stations, but they sometimes can also play that part in local communities. But there can also be some more, sort of corporate, I guess, newspapers. I'm thinking always of my local newspaper, which is the Mercury News, that used to get awards for investigative reporting in the local community, and now is a shadow of its former self and has no investigative reporters. So that's what I think of when I think about local journalism.
And it's interesting that you talked there about investigative journalism, because so much about making sure that we have accurate information is also about making sure that our journalists have the tools to be out in the field to, kind of hold kind of public policy to account, to hold elected officials to account. And sometimes when that is lacking, that can be where kind of disinformation kind of creeps in. But Paula, I want to hear from you when we talk about disinformation, from your experience, from your decades in the industry. How does disinformation kind of manifest itself? It feels like a word that we're hearing, we've heard so much more over the past kind of 4 or 5 years, but, disinformation has a history that goes back much further than that, doesn't it?
Yes, no, it does. And in, looking at a definition, disinformation, where there's that kind of deliberate and intentional dissemination of false and misleading information, as opposed to like misinformation, which isn't necessarily intentional spreading of falsehoods. So it's very deliberate. It manifests itself in different ways. And just some of the work that we've done recently, of course, we know some of the big examples, but I'll use, some that, like the work with the census that we did, where There were threats from bad actors spreading false information, like, who's supposed to participate in the census, how to participate in the census. It's designed to discourage certain populations from participating and threaten the integrity of the count, primarily for political reasons, right? There's that disenfranchisement that comes when with representation in Congress. With elections, and I'll just use an example that's more of a local example to California. You have disinformation used historically as a political tool. And just this last election, I know people were following the election of, or the defeat of Mayor Michael Tubbs in Stockton. And there was a recent article about, a Facebook disinformation campaign, targeting him. And it was engineered by, political enemies. And they released this kind of steady stream of false narratives about his activities as mayor. And, he ended up surprisingly not winning a second term. Coronavirus, of course, disinformation on stopping the spread of the virus, politically motivated, so, and of course, I'm sure we'll talk more about that with the past administration. But it manifests itself in so many different ways. But it's important to know that it's it's deliberate and it's intentional.
And Sarabeth, when we kind of think then about, and Anne, I want you to kind of chime in on this too, when we kind of start thinking about then the role of social media, kind of digital platforms, newsletters, how does that really kind of feed into how disinformation is spread? Because so often, when we think about local news, it's newspapers, which we have seen, I think the figures from the kind of expanding news desert project from UNC, just from like 2018 through to 2020, we saw something like 300 news outlets close in California, close. We saw another 6,000 journalists lose their job. It may actually even be more now that we're heading into 2021 and beyond. But when we look at the social media aspect of all of this, kind of how much of a role is that playing in the kind of spread of disinformation?
Yeah, the spread of disinformation is like the weeds that have grown up in the vacant lot that have been left by the decline of local news. I mean, you just mentioned the dynamics. This has been like a slow moving crisis over the last decade and a half that social media and the internet have really created, which is that we have completely disrupted the business model. For 150 years, local news relied on advertising dollars to support the journalism. And that has been basically entirely displaced onto the internet. And what that's meant, from afar, that can really look like the natural rise and fall of an industry. Some industries, a lot of industries were really disrupted by the internet. But in this case, the decline of local news has had really dire impacts on our communities, on people, on our democracy. And the data really backs it up. It's actually really fascinating. There's data that shows that when a local newspaper goes away, voter participation drops. Like, people are less likely to vote if they don't have information about their communities. It makes sense. If you don't know about the election, if you don't know about the issues, why would you go vote? And civic engagement drops. People are less likely to get involved in their communities. They're less likely to run for office if they don't know about the issues that matter to their community. And there's also data that shows that when a newspaper goes away, it has impacts on polarization, that people are less likely to split their ticket between parties in communities where a newspaper has gone away. And what has filled the void is echo chambers of social media and national media. I mean, it's really, I recently read a study that showed that people have stayed consistently knowledgeable about who their national politicians are. Like, people know who these national political celebrities are: AOC, Donald Trump, Joe Biden. People don't know, and they decreasingly know who's their governor, who are their state elected officials. The fact is, the things that matter to your life play out in your community. And frankly, just from a monetary standpoint, most of your tax dollars are going to your community, your state. Like, you should know about that.
Yeah, like know who your local judges are and how to be able to vote for them. I mean, Ann Ravel, you know, kind of your work has looked at kind of, you know, strategies around kind of addressing disinformation in digital spaces. Kind of tell us a little bit about that and kind of what some of the solutions perhaps that you were able to stumble upon.
Yeah. Well, let me add one thing. And what I'm the head of the director of what I call digital deception, because I think it's a more accurate word than even disinformation, because people aren't clear about that. And it's obvious that it's purposeful and intended to impact not only our society, but especially our democracy and politics. And so the work that I've been doing around that is to try to figure out where this all comes from, just what your question was. And it's clear that a lot of the origins of this disinformation actually comes from elected officials. And sometimes those national news media that are still in existence, because they're 24/7 newsrooms and they have to fill the void, and they're more interested in outrage than they are in facts or opinion, rather than actually giving detailed information about things to people. And then they get spread to the internet. And the problem with the internet and the platforms is that they can take one of these false statements, whether it be about the virus, whether it be about how African Americans shouldn't vote because it's bad for them to vote, and they can spread it to millions of people. And they have, and mostly it's false information, and the most outrageous information and the most inflammatory information that gets spread. And it's done in part by algorithms of the social media, which use those because they also have so much information on all of us, not just from the platforms, but they take it from other places. And for example, Facebook has been known to have far more detailed, precise information about every single American than the US government has about them. And they're able to utilize that and micro-target it with information that's inflammatory to create, for example, what we saw on the 6th of the groups that went to the Capitol, because they can go to little dark parts of the web. And so we've been thinking about, because being in campaign finance, and I know that there are a lot of laws that are constitutional that have been upheld, where you can actually demand greater accountability, greater transparency, for example, in the kind of micro-targeting that is being used, and making people be able on the platforms to be able to opt in rather than opt out, and also to make them be more transparent about the algorithms that they're using to spread this information to people. And there's many other ways that we're thinking about and hoping, for example, that the Biden administration will be amenable to pressing for some of this, because we know that this is what is undermining not only local news, and you're absolutely right, it is undermining civic engagement, and it's polarizing people, and it's causing violence. And those are things that are patently illegal. So you got me on my high horse, and I probably didn't answer your question.
No, that's fine. Let me kind of just jump in there though, because what all of this seems to say is that we're talking about disinformation, and we're going to kind of very much get back into that in a moment. But this also speaks to media literacy. You know, if you are not, you know, you need to know where to go to set your Facebook account to particular types of settings, or you need to know when you read a headline to perhaps to kind of question, is that quite right? So Sarabeth Berman, just to kind of bring you in here, how much of this is disinformation, but how much of this also is kind of educating the audience, helping the audience understand, like, here's what you should be looking out for. Here are some of the things that may be a little bit suspect, or you may need to question. Essentially, like, what are we doing about the media literacy part of this?
Media literacy is definitely extraordinarily important. Last year, there was this study, an international test called PISA, where they test 15-year-olds all around the world and compare their results. And one of the most striking stats from there was that only 12% of American students could tell the difference between fact and opinion. So that matters. But the other thing is, I don't think we can pretend that you can just go to people who have come to believe misinformation and say, here are the facts. These are the facts. Now you know the facts. Now you believe the facts. Like, that's not how this is going to work. This is about trust. And we have eroded trust. We are at an all-time low in terms of trust in our media. And so, we think about January 6th, where there were people who were sieging the Capitol and they had a sense of reality. And then there were people watching those images in horror with an entirely different sense of reality. And the question you have to ask is, how do you begin to come to a shared reality? And I think that has to start in communities. I mean, the data shows that people trust local news much more than they trust national news. They're much more inclined to trust local news. And frankly, it makes sense. I mean, you build trust through relationships, and you can have a relationship with your local news. Ann was saying, like, local news is about having a relationship with your community. Over the last decade and a half, 60% of journalists have lost their jobs, which frankly means it's just a lot less likely that you've ever met a journalist. And it's certainly a lot less likely that when you read an article, you feel any relationship to it. It's not because local news has gone away. Like, it's unlikely that you've read an article about a store that you patron or a school system that you send your kids to. So I think, like, a lot of beating back misinformation and really, like, confronting these separate realities we're living in is going to be the act of rebuilding trust, and that's going to have to happen in communities. And that's why I think we just have to be really leaning into, how do we build back local news? And I'm excited to talk about, because we think there is, like, really, really a lot of potential out there for how you go about doing that.
Can I jump in on this?
Actually, one second. I do actually want to go to Paulette, because this is very much kind of where her work is concentrated, kind of with the California Publishers Association, and also kind of with Black Voices. Paulette, talk to me about that building trust in community part, because, again, if we're talking about local newspapers, we're not necessarily talking about publications that are being made available to communities of color, but also, what does it look like when you're trying to provide and build trust for communities that are non-English speakers? So talk to us a bit about that particular challenge, because it's not straightforward at all, is it?
No, and there is that national, cable news that, people are being fed this kind of steady diet of information that is influenced by political agendas and political ideology. I think at the local level, like Sarah's saying, is where we can make a difference. I think of the work that I do, being very grounded in the Black press and of the history and traditions of the Black press as kind of vital, trusted messengers. And that's a lot of the work I do statewide. When I do consulting is utilizing the Black press as trusted messengers in their community, keeping the kind of collective history, the delivering the essential news and information, and kind of calling out discrimination and racism as that history. And it was really founded to combat, when you think of the history of the Black press, to kind of combat disinformation about the community. Like, over almost 200 years ago, actually, we're getting close to the 200-year founding of the Black press. And, some say it was founded because Black America was ignored, but I would say it wasn't just ignored, but it was demonized and criminalized, right? And you can look at even some of the recent racial reckoning conversations and apologies by mainstream newspapers, that kind of really lay out that history of racism and how they've treated communities. But I think for Black press and then other communities of color, media and communities of color that's been active and thriving and growing in their community. We talk about news deserts, and I was recently looking at, I think it was a report from UCR on ethnic media in California, and there were almost 300 outlets and communities of color in California. And when you look at the research on news deserts, there's a gap. There's some missing because they're kind of there working in their communities and they're not seen necessarily by researchers. So the work we're doing in California is really to identify and try to map the news ecosystem in communities of color. So you have those outlets are serving that same type of role of trusted messenger. And we have this is an example, a case study we'll be releasing soon on the LA Media Table called Mobilizing Trust and Inclusive Communications. We were a part of an activation of that media table, about 25 outlets in LA, mainly in LA City, but around LA County as well. And this was something leading up to the November election, just to give an example. So you remember the Trump administration was kind of hollowing out the US Postal Service. We had mail-in ballots preferred because of the pandemic. We had these unauthorized ballot boxes that were popping up throughout the state. And so there was a lot of questions about how do you vote during this pandemic? And there was some intentional kind of suppression, right, of especially in communities of color. So what we did, and I'm excited, I can't wait till we actually release this report, was engage 20 community media outlets representing 10 ethnic communities of 7 languages. We did a combination of paid campaign, but then there was just a lot of coordinated commentaries, op-eds, amplifying the voices of trusted community messengers, messages of voting justice, integrity of the ballot box, how to vote safely. There were a lot of questions and concerns in the polling about how to vote safely during a pandemic. And what's great is, part of the reader surveys that we've done, and we're trying to work better. And this is something that as a sector and industry, we need to do a better job of measuring impact of the message. So we incorporate that into the work we do. Over 90% of the readers recalled seeing content about the voting process. Over 80% found it helpful to better understanding their voting options and helping them make a plan. So the work we're doing with these outlets is really elevating trust and combating disinformation. So I think that the kernels of what we're talking about are there. I think we need to do a better job of, like I said, measuring the impact. And California, we're definitely, moving in that direction. But while we have the national issues, I think within communities, we're seeing there is some opportunities to combat that disinformation.
And sorry, I kind of went to Paulette. I know you had wanted to jump in, slide in there.
I just wanted to respond to your question about media literacy, because I mean, when it relates particularly to politics, that those people who are invested in reading national politics, for example, they are already polarized. So it's like they're on a team and they just read the things for their particular team. And other people are kind of checked out. And what has been shown, for example, on when Facebook or Twitter or somebody indicates that something is false, people don't care. They really don't care. They just read it anyway. They believe it anyway. The fact that they have put some notation on it that there's falsehood doesn't impact people's reading and beliefs. And the same was true. I know the Knight Foundation, because I'm on the Markkula Center board, that they were working together on having a T that says this is from a trusted source versus something else. And that too was shown to be irrelevant to people. So I'm not sure that having people learn literacy and understand is really going to do the trick. I think that what Paulette just said and what Sarabeth said is probably a much better way to enable local journalism, which is much more trusted. There's been surveys about it, and that is more likely to make a difference.
Well, and it's Ann, to your point, it's also the people. Like when you look at those platforms and those media outlets, they're so tied to their community. So even when we were doing work around the census, we were doing these focus groups, and we were asking people, like, who do they trust? Like, if someone told you, that you should fill out your census form, who do you trust? And it was the person at the nonprofit that helped them with their issue. It wasn't even necessarily the elected official. Like we were looking at influencers, and then we're working with consultants who are talking about the athletes or the movie stars or or even these elected officials, and we were hearing from the people like, no, I trust Joe, who is the one who helps me with my bus pass. So we had to look at who are those real trusted messengers, and then try to incorporate that into the reporting that was done. But yeah, it's really so hyper local.
But even having the trusted messengers, as you put it, like I love that phrase, Paula, even having those trusted messengers, we all had this conversation in our pre-call, we all said the same thing, that none of us have an attention span anymore. We look at the headline and it's like, oh, that looks interesting. And we hit retweet, share, what have you, or we'll kind of put it in a WhatsApp chat and kind of send it on without necessarily kind of reading the substance of what's in there. So how do we, even if we kind of have a substantial and sustained, and Sarabeth, I want to get into this with you, that the kind of, the how we finance and how we kind of fully support our local news endeavors going forward. But how do we get around this very kind of big elephant in the room where people just don't have the attention span anymore? It's like, Paulette, not to call you out, it's like, how many books did you say that you've read this year, maybe, or last year, maybe like one or two?
Yeah.
Because we just don't either have time, or we just don't have the patience or the attention span just to be able to really look at something and look at it critically. So how do we get around that? And actually, Paulette, I'll start with you, go to you, Sarah, and then go to you, Anne.
I do not, I don't have an answer for that one. Like I told you, I'm even guilty of, tweeting things that I haven't read the full story. Like for me, it's like, okay, if it's a trusted source and I read, the headline, it may be part of it, but I'm so guilty, as I said, of that. I definitely don't have an answer. I'd love to hear from my fellow panelists. There's
some really interesting news organizations that really recognize this, but recognize also their role in trying to meet people where they are. So we just invested in this organization called Documented, which is out of New York City. They serve immigrant populations. Their goal is to serve local news for immigrant populations. They've created a huge WhatsApp channel filled with a Spanish language WhatsApp channel where they are sharing the reporting that they're doing through that channel, and they're hearing back from their audience, so that's informing their reporting. So we can't be tied to old mediums of how we deliver news, but we still have to be out there delivering. There's another organization out there called Outlier Media in Michigan. They're creating a text-based platform. They're interacting with their audience through text. Their goal is to serve low-income communities and really meet people where they are, and they're on text. And so they've created a platform so that they can both hear from their community, understand what their information needs are, but also serve back the investigations they're doing and the service reporting they're doing. So I think, local news, we need local news, and it can't just look like newspapers being delivered by a paper boy on your doorstep. It has to evolve.
Yes. Anne?
Well, I still like old local news, and
I do too. Don't get me wrong. I love a good newspaper on my doorstep.
yeah, just kidding, of course. But you know, I think, of course, that what's happened in part that people have such little attention span is because of the development of the internet and platforms, and how you just look at the headline, or you just look at somebody's viewpoint, and since you're on that same team politically or for whatever reason, or it's your friend and you believe it, you don't bother delving into it. I don't think it's because we're all busy. I mean, we are all busy, but it is possible to get actual facts. And so what has happened, I think, with this is that people just look at issues like their litmus tests. And you and I talked a little bit about this because it bothers me. It's true even in national news, where there are articles that have these inflammatory headlines. And one example of that had to do with Hillary Clinton and the emails. And then no one delved down into the depth of the article, which essentially rebutted some of it. But as a result, it's that headline that gets spread everywhere. And that's what everybody believes. They're not going to read the depth of the article anyway, because it's been spread this way on the internet. And I do think that some of this is the fault of what has happened to national news as well. And that we have to go back to what we used to have, which were truly journalistic principles about, you know, not just balance, not just making sure that you covered. In fact, Trump got covered a whole lot more in the 2016 election than Hillary Clinton ever did. And I think that what we really need is more thoughtfulness at the top as well as at the bottom.
At the crux and at the core of all of this, though, is funding. You know, local news, national news, newspapers, radio, TV, you know, kind of social only platforms all need funding. And we've seen, as you know, the numbers that we quoted from the UNC, University of North Carolina, expanding news desert project between 2018 and 2020, that we saw the loss of 300 news outlets, the loss of 6,000 journalism jobs. And that's just in the space of 2 years, not even 15 years that they've actually been doing this research. So Sarabeth Berman, like, how do we tackle, I know that this is your thing, this is your jam, you know, how do we tackle this part about revenue, you know, especially here when, you know, the impact of COVID, we saw even just here in California where I work, pretty much every station that I work with either had to furlough or they had to reduce staff because they've really taken a hit with underwriting and other kind of revenue sources from, you know, foundations and so on. So how do we tackle the money part? Like, how do we keep the money coming in so that journalists can be hired, publications, radio stations, TV outlets, etc., can actually provide that local news that people so much need?
This is the question. This is the money question.
This is the money question. Let's go.
No, like the fundamental question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we finance and sustain an informed citizenry? Like, we call it local news, but that's what we're talking about. How do we do it? We have relied on a market transaction for a long time. It worked really well. Advertising dollars, the original micro-targeting, that worked really well to support local news. It's no longer there. So I think the model that is most promising, the one that we're really seeing is working in different places around the country, is looking at these as civic institutions, looking to the model of other institutions that are fundamental to our society. The ballet, you mentioned that I'm involved in the arts, the ballet, the opera. These are institutions that we know are really important to our communities, and that we finance and sustain as nonprofit organizations that have the organizations that we're supporting they have philanthropic revenue that plays a very big role, but they're building diversified revenue models. So they're bringing in some advertising money, because there is still some advertising money out there. They're getting their readers to become members. I mean, we saw many news organizations had huge surges actually in memberships, because people they're sitting at home and they get that this is important and they're reading. We think philanthropists have a very important role to play here. I think philanthropists across this country should be adding journalism, and specifically local journalism, to their portfolio, because if you care about education, you should worry about whether or not school boards are covered. If you care about the environment, you need to worry about whether or not there are journalists who are covering carbon emissions from their local businesses. And the list goes on and on. And so what we're seeing is a new generation of organizations that are using a nonprofit mixed revenue model. And I also think there is a real role for public dollars in the long run. And there is some work happening at the state level and at the national level to follow the lead of other advanced democracies that put a lot more tax dollars into a thriving free press. So all of those things, I think, are leading us to believe there is a path towards financing and sustaining local news. Some of the organizations that we're funding, I'll mention one. So one of the organizations we're funding is an organization called Vermont Digger. It's now the largest newsroom in Vermont. It is powered through, as I said, diverse revenue. They have major gifts, small dollar gifts, they have ad revenue, they run events. They've been able to sustain this newsroom. And they were recently credited by Senator Leahy, their senator, for having a really crucial role in the spread of accurate information about COVID-19. Vermont has been one of the most successful states in the country in terms of maintaining, in terms of the spread of the virus. And people credit VT Digger for just extraordinarily consistent information out there about the virus, daily newsletters, FAQs, and fascinatingly, it showed up in revenue. They had their best year yet in terms of major gifts. Donors appreciated the value that they were playing in society, in their community, and in revenue, they've had the best year of memberships yet.
I'd love to add, with Sarabeth, I would totally agree with what Sarabeth is saying about the mixed revenue model. Like, we're just seeing that throughout the state with the work we do. It's not going to be one stream. It's no longer going to be, advertising revenue. Philanthropy will play an important role. Audience supported journalism is also in the events. I mean, there's so many different, and I think you need to diversify your revenue streams. If the pandemic didn't teach you anything, it is teaching you to have a diverse revenue streams. We've been able to, in California, for instance, raise money through Media and Color from philanthropy, and it's not the traditional media philanthropic organizations. So these are the foundations that care about, health of Californians, care about, our civic life, care about economic disparities. And so they want to support journalism and believe we need a strong journalism ecosystem in the state, and they want to help support that. So we're developing this kind of resiliency project where we focus on business model transformation for more of our legacy ethnic media outlets, but also looking at programs to support new journalists, new journalism entrepreneurs. But it's going to definitely be diverse. And I think and even at the local level, we're looking at what's happening with community foundations and media impact funds in specific communities, collaborations that are forming in certain regions that are supported by local philanthropy. So I think it's going to take all of us to solve the problem. And I think it's happening, like I said, in various places, at least throughout the state of California, we're seeing that.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of collaborations and stuff as well, where people recognize it's well, actually, we want to serve our local audiences and we can't do it alone. So what can we do if we actually kind of come together? I want to transition to some questions from the audience. Thank you to everyone who's online sending these through, incredibly thoughtful. Someone did actually send through a question about raising money and revenue. So Sarabeth and Paulette, I think you've handled that. But I think this is a really interesting question that we have here that says, could you talk about how local social media groups and apps like Nextdoor are filling a local news void and the issues that that raises? I know where I live, our Nextdoor is very active, both with stuff that is useful, that can help, you know, kind of local neighbors get groceries and what have you. And there's some stuff on there that you're like, I'm not sure that that's been fact checked. So Paulette, maybe you'd like to take that, Sarabeth and Anne, and jump in as you like. So yeah, the role of the likes of Nextdoor and those kind of apps and what they mean for local news.
Yeah, I know there's some partnerships that, and once again, those are like, you know, like platforms, like Facebook, like Twitter, but it's, you know, geographically targeted to your community. And like you said, I'm seeing the same thing in my Nextdoor. So it would be, you know, maybe a headline from public information officer in, you know, the county, which is great. So it's like, you know, some news that we need to know. I know there are some partnerships with media outlets, so I think there's some experimentation that's happening that's interesting. But like you said, there's still things that aren't vetted. And you know, it's like a WeChat channel where it could be good information, it could, you know, be information that's false, that's being spread. So I think we're going to see the same type of, you know, challenges with those kind of platforms that we're seeing with you know, traditionally with social media.
I'll just add, you know, Joanne, your very first question was, what's your definition of local news? And I said specifically original reporting. I mean, there is a lot of things. The internet, in some ways, obviously, it's completely disrupted the industry and caused a lot of the crises that we're in. But it also, the silver lining here is that it's also going to make it much cheaper to build back the future of local news, because there are a lot of aspects that the former newspapers played in our communities that aren't necessary. You know, restaurant reviews, movie reviews. Sure, some local news outlets may choose to do that. There's a new wonderful news outlet in Oakland called the Oakland Side that has a bunch of reporting on local local restaurants, and that's great. But the Nextdoor and apps like that do provide some information that a newspaper doesn't need to do. But folks posting on a Nextdoor community are not reporters. They're not picking up the phone call to fact check and ask questions. They're not digging into the details of, you know, documents of whether or not that's accurate or inaccurate. And so I would say that certainly Nextdoor and apps like that have they're obviously negative effects, but also positive effects to keeping communities informed. It's not the same thing as original reporting.
Yeah. I want to jump in with another question. Anne, I think I'll direct this one to you, and it just kind of moved off of my screen here. Let me just scroll down. Here we go. Why is there so much pushback towards the idea of government funding of local news if we could set proper checks and balances on it?
Yeah, I don't know why there's that pushback, and I think a lot of people are worried that it's going to have government having an impact on what is covered, but I don't really believe that's true. If the local news or even statewide news media is funded through government, and I think it should be. In fact, I think there's a number of things that we should do as a government. For example, I mean, because all of this problem of the economics of particularly local newspapers came because of social media, I think that what we see, though, is that social media is now also aggregating content from other places, and I think they should have to be assessed a fee by government. I also think that local governments should have some kind of a set aside because they advertise in the newspaper often and can, and they should have a set aside for doing it in the local press and in the minority press as well, the more ethnic press as well, in Spanish and in all of the different media. But we could also be giving having a tax on the advertising that they have on social media. Look, the government always has done certain legislation to impact independent companies and the like for the public interest. And that's what they should be doing now. And I would advocate for that. And I think they should definitely have a part in it together with the other funders that you're talking about.
Yeah, and can I just add what Ann mentioned, like the local government advertising dollars? There was just a recent report, the Center for Community Media in New York had worked with the mayor's office, and they've directed a certain amount of advertising, city advertising, to especially ethnic media in the state, in the city. And so they just released a report on how successful, that has been. And I know other cities and other states like California are looking to that. That was, something for in California that really helped the ethnic media sector, was just the recent, advertising with the census, and how much of it was directed to media outlets that were in community instead of digital, advertising or outdoor advertising, but real focus on activating the community and ethnic media as trust, like I said, trusted messengers in their community, and with much success when we look at our self-response rate here in California.
Mm-hmm. Another question, actually, that probably just to Paulette and Sarah, I think just some stuff that you were talking about with OpenSide and with Outlier. But one audience question says, how do we handle racial or gender orientation divisions that divide local communities and other demographics influencing news outlets' focus or slant? Paulette, do you want to jump on that?
What, can you repeat it?
Yeah. How do we handle racial or gender orientation divisions that divide local communities and other demographics influencing news outlets' focus or slant?
Focused or slant?
Slant. Sorry, I'm saying it with my British accent. Slant. Slant. Slant.
Go ahead, Paulette.
I know. I think that we're seeing some. I mentioned a little, like, collaborations that are happening in the media space, where we're working together more. And I think that's one of those opportunities where we can deal with some of the racial divisions, things that have divided us in the past, that we're not seeing as much as we should, I think, in terms of ethnic media and others collaborating. But we're trying to develop that with these media tables within region, where we're working across culture, and we're trying to kind of tear down some of those divisions by looking at what some of the, what are the priority issues in a specific community, and how can we all work to help in our reporting, to solve those problems. So I think some of those collaborations that are happening statewide, or it may be one of those ways that we can deal with that problem.
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, we can't just be nostalgic for what was in local news. Like, local news has to do a much better job of reflecting the diversity of its communities. And that means building newsrooms that are reflective of those communities, having newsrooms that have a culture and environment that allows those reporters that reflect the diversity to identify stories that are about the diversity of communities, of different communities. And the other is we have to set up newsrooms that are really listening to their audience and directing their editorial accordingly. I mean, one of the newsrooms that we helped launch in West Virginia is a newsroom called Mountain State Spotlight. It's now the second largest newsroom in West Virginia, and some of the most extraordinary local reporters in West Virginia have founded this newsroom. And they just recently, this week, put out an email calling to a survey to all of their readers to give them advice on, as the new legislative session opens up, what do you want to hear? What do you want to learn? And, this is a place where one of the elected state legislators stormed the Capitol a couple of weeks ago. Like, this is but they're going to listen to their readers and they're going to use that to inform their editorial choices. And I think that can begin to address the questions that the questioner asked.
Yeah, and we see that at stations like here in California. The brilliant work that Ashley Alvarado is doing at KPCC is very much about that. It's like, even with COVID, it was like, there's a lot of information, but what information do you actually need? And that actually kind of drive, what it is, the journalism that is being done. And thank you, Sarah, that actually addresses the question that someone here had put in the channel. We have just around about 5 minutes or so left. I want to make sure that we get to this question. What role might individual writer-centric platforms like Substack play in local journalism? And the writer says, I'm imagining a subscription that promises 1 to 2 high-quality local stories per week. But yeah, that's kind of, again, we've been talking a lot about platforms and different places that people can get their information. What role does Substack and a Medium and kind of other platforms like that play as we think about local news? And I think raise a hand, because I think any of you could actually take this question.
I can give it a try. I think there is definitely a role for platforms like that. It is true that I go back to the original reporting that most of Substack newsletters right now are not original reporting. They're either aggregating or they're opinions or thoughts or and there is some, and I think there's potential for that. I also lean into a belief that local reporting and building local newsrooms is a team sport, that writers need editors, and that you need the engines to be able to really listen to your community and guide your community. So I think this is a both and. There are platforms like that that are giving individual reporters a way to make revenue through their newsletters is great, and that will sustain more journalists across the country. But we also really do need to be supporting newsrooms that are anchoring communities and are holding themselves accountable for providing the news and information that communities need. So
I'd add, just something going back to something we were talking about, media literacy, and you mentioned, Sarabeth, you mentioned like opinions, and for people to really understand the difference between opinions and original reporting, and going back to what Ann said about like the journalistic principles, even understanding what journalism is. And I think we have to figure out how to help educate, our communities on that, because I think that until we can get that piece fixed, we're still going to have this huge problem.
Yeah, we have literally just a few minutes before we close, but we don't want to leave it all kind of doom and gloom, because it's not. There is a place and much need for local news. So I want you all to kind of take probably about 45 minutes to a minute just to kind of talk about what you see as kind of one solution as we in local news really try to kind of tackle this issue of disinformation, misinformation. Ann Ravel, I'm going to start with you. What's the solution that you see as we try to tackle this really huge issue?
I think one of the reasons that local news and news outlets are so well respected is because they are transparent. And one of the problems that we have in social media and also in some of the bigger outlets is there isn't that transparency. And that is the one thing, and I know that Sarabeth was talking about trust in government, and institutions, which is something I care deeply about. That's going to make the difference. It's when local news is, because of all the way we're going to be funding it, is going to be back with a vengeance. And trust me, it shouldn't be Nextdoor, because I've seen some really terrible things on Nextdoor. But I think that once it gets rehabilitated, it's really going to make a huge difference in our community and have people feel more trust, more, as was said, more voting, more civic engagement. So there is a good light at the end of the tunnel, I think, for our country, if there's more of that trust from local news.
Thank you. Paulette?
Yeah, I think for me, bright spots is I see people have identified it as an important aspect of our civic life that we need to support. And across the board, there is, I think, support to provide resources from the local donor to the large philanthropies. And so that's for me, like just seeing that the current interest in supporting the sector is the bright spot. And going into for me personally, last year we did quite well with grant funding because COVID was a challenge. Conversations of racial justice and equity was a huge topic. And so, we saw for BIPOC, especially media outlets, just, funding to support our work and help us look towards the future and support the work of the future. So I'm excited about, and for me, the current interest in, finding the solutions, and even at the government level, funding, government funding, philanthropy, and then of course donors. But I'm excited about what I'm seeing when it comes to funding and supporting journalism, local journalism.
Sarabeth.
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of what both of my colleagues have said, but just to say, in this last election cycle, we spent $14 billion on the election cycle, more than we've ever spent on any election. If we take a small portion of that energy and place it into the basic civic infrastructure of our communities, we could make a real dent in this. So I think, there is a new generation of nonprofit newsrooms. There are public radio stations that are really leaning into original reporting. There is a lot out there. And I think, philanthropists who should lean in hard. Individuals should be making their monthly donations. And there is real potential to build this civic infrastructure back up.
Well, we're at our hour. This is a great way to spend a lunchtime, and my kid also stayed quiet for the hour, which was absolutely fantastic. I mean, there's so much to discuss around kind of local news, the future of. I think, as always, we will always encourage anyone that's out there listening or watching this on the replay, support your local media in whatever way that you can. Read, share responsibly, support financially if you can. Send a letter to the editor. Like, we do read them, we promise. But before we go, we just want to say a really big thank you to our guest for today, Paulette Brown-Hinds. She's the founder of Voice Media Ventures, among many other titles that she holds. Also, Ann Ravel is an attorney and professor at UC Berkeley Law, also just one of many titles that she holds. And also Sarabeth Berman, the CEO of the American Journalism Project. Thank you all just so much for a very insightful conversation. It's been a real pleasure to speak with all of you. Thank you to Zócalo and the Center for Social Innovation at the University of California, Riverside for presenting this conversation. And of course to our audience this afternoon for your really great and thoughtful questions. Obviously our democracy is in good hands with everyone kind of doing their part. You can read a summary of our conversation at Zócalo's website tomorrow, along with some short interviews with all of our guest speakers today. But for now, again, thank you so much for joining us, and please do enjoy the rest of your afternoon.